Outside the Book continues from the 2016 Southern Kentucky Book Festival. I'm Barbara Deeb, and I'm honored to have with me Michael Hingson, who's joining us right now with his guide dog, Africa. Now, you have a fascinating story, and we would probably need 3 shows to tell your whole story, but you were born blind?
I was born blind born in 1950, premature, given too much oxygen, which caused blindness, so essentially born blind.
Okay, but you had the wonderful fortune to grow up in a family where you were not treated as sightless.
My parents were told to send me away because no blind child could ever grow up to amount to anything in society, and my parents said that's absolutely not true. So they brought me home, and I was brought up with the attitude that I could do whatever I chose to do, and that I could make something of my life if I wanted to do that. I was given the same kind of responsibility as my older brother and raised just as any other child would be.
That's a beautiful gift from your parents. You have 2 books, Thunderdog and Running with Roselle.
Right.
And the motivation for this, of course, is I understand it is your goal to educate the world about parity in a sighted world.
It is a sighted world just because there are more of all of you than there are blind people. So all y'all have the lion's share of visibility, and as a result the world is made up in a way to cater to people who can see. But what we really ought to be is an inclusive world. In our society today, we are hearing about so many different kinds of people, whether it be different religions, whether it be different colors, even sexual orientation, and women for that matter. It's kind of funny to hear women called a minority when there are more women than men, but I understand that, again, that's the way the world has been, but the world is changing, and the world needs to change based on disabilities as well. You know, the largest minority in this country, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, is disabilities. 20% of all people have a disability. Now, there are a lot of disabilities, of course, but by the way the world is operating today, you don't hear disabilities discussed. One of the presidential candidates has anything related to disabilities on their website, and even there, Hillary Clinton doesn't say a lot about disabilities.
But it's mentioned. You know, I have to say something.
But it's mentioned.
Yeah, Michael, before we got started,
yeah.
You were talking about the books, your book, and you said, I only see you have one, and I made a little joke at you, and you said, look up the definition of see. Share that.
Well, see is something that we all use. The definition of see, in part in the dictionary, is to perceive. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is with the eye. And when people say, oh, well, you can't see, the reality is, as I say in Thunderdog here, don't let your sight get in the way of your vision. The fact is that I see just like you do. I don't see in the same way that you do, but I see. I see with every sense that I have. I wish more people used more of their senses and not just their eyes.
Or just common sense in general. Now, you have a fascinating story, and Roselle was your guide dog for a long time, and she was with you on that fated day of September 11th. You were in the World Trade Center.
Right. I was working in the World Trade Center on September 11th. I ran an office for a computer company, Quantum Corporation. I was hired to open a New York facility and to staff it and make it work to sell our products as well as to provide appropriate support for them. So I did that, and on September 11th, we were going to be conducting a sales training seminar when the aircraft struck the tower, and of course the world changed.
You were on what floor?
I was on the 78th floor of the North Tower, or Tower 1.
Do you remember that day?
Oh, absolutely, vividly. I remember the first thing that happened is we heard sort of a muffled explosion, and then the building, if you imagine my arm is the building, and as I tip it toward you, that's what the building did. We actually moved, I think, about 20 feet before the building stopped and came back. Buildings, as we learned later, are made to be flexible when they're very tall because they will be buffeted by winds and so on. So I immediately jumped into action, if you will, and encouraged people to go to the stairs, not to take the elevator, because a colleague of mine who was in the office that day was seeing fire and burning debris falling outside our window. So I got people to finally focus. My colleague David got them to the stairs. Then after we knew everyone had left the tower, David, Frank, Roselle and I left the building by starting down the
Roselle,
stairs.
your guide dog.
Roselle, right.
You know, as you're telling me this story, I'm hearing and thinking what a true advantage in that moment you had because of your sharpened perceptions and senses in other ways.
Well, yes and no. People often try to think of it that way, but that's not really the case. It's a mindset. I went into that building every day wondering if for some reason there might be an emergency and how would I be able to react to it and how would I get out. I learned what to do to travel around the complex. I learned how to travel around New York because I had developed those skills as a blind person. I learned how to live as a blind person and how to live in the same world as everyone else, although doing part of what I did in different ways. So it wasn't that senses were sharper or anything like that. It's that I learned to use the senses that I had. I also, as we talk in Thunderdog, was observing some things or seeing things that David, my colleague, was not. When he was panicking and saying there's fire and smoke and millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside the window, what I was observing was Roselle sitting next to me, not reacting at all. Now, what you need to understand is Roselle was afraid of thunder, but nothing was fazing her. She was acting like, who woke me up? I was sleeping peacefully, and all of a sudden I can't sleep anymore because there's too much noise and everything else is going on.
That
told me that whatever was going on wasn't so urgent that we couldn't evacuate in an orderly way.
So
Dogs,
you were reading her.
I was reading her as she reads me, because if I had started to panic, that's going to make her more nervous, and as a result, she's going to be looking at me rather than focusing on what I want her to do, which is to guide and help us leave the complex. So it's a team effort, which is part of what we talk about in Thunderdog. It's all about the team.
It's a beautiful, beautiful legacy to guide dogs and to people with disabilities. Running with Roselle and Thunderdog are your books. Michael Hingson, you lost Roselle in June of
June 2011, and then I received Africa. Actually, a couple of years later, I had another guide dog in between, just for a brief period. So now, Africa and I travel the country talking about all the things that we talked about earlier, trying to get people to understand that normal is never going to be the same, and that we need to understand that normal isn't necessarily the way we think it is. We need to be a more inclusive world.
Thank you so much for including us in your world. We've been talking with Michael Hingson from Outside the Book.